Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for coming out this morning. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Two brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, there will be a question and answer period following the panel discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I'm president of the Center for American Progress, and I'm really thrilled to have you all here for this incredible event. Before we get started, I want to thank all our partners in the Change Terms Reducing Hate Online Coalition who played an integral role in the work we will talk about today. I want to recognize the amazing folks at Color of Change, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Free Press, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, and the National Hispanic Media Coalition as well for helping make this event possible. We all know the vital role that social media has played in expanding racial justice and achieving meaningful change in our lives, in our society, from Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement. But we also have seen the very same platforms can serve as a vehicle for spreading hatred and as a weapon for radical groups looking to recruit new members. The outbreak of mail bombs we have witnessed since yesterday is yet another horrible reminder that in today's political environment, there are extremists who are all too willing to transform dangerous rhetoric into acts of terror and violence. And we have seen over and over again that online misinformation and hate speech pose a grave threat to our democracy and to the lives of innocent Americans. Last year, the deadly neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, was organized using Facebook, PayPal, and the gaming app Discord. We also know that Dylann Roof, the white supremacist who murdered 9 people at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, claimed that he was radicalized by websites pushing racist lies about an epidemic of, quote, black on white violence. Now, with the midterm elections less than 2 weeks away, we are reminded once again of the incredible responsibility that online companies must acknowledge and act upon. It has been increasingly evident how Russia tried to influence the 2016 elections through social media campaigns on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, campaigns that were designed to sow discord in our nation based on race, ethnicity, and religion. Fortunately, in recent years, firms like Google, Facebook, and Twitter have taken some steps to reduce online hate, from increasing transparency about their content removal process to flagging dangerous materials and better restricting the use of dehumanizing language. What's more, almost every major platform and internet-based service has updated their terms of service and community agreements. But ultimately, there is still much, much more work to be done. That's why today we are proud to launch a new initiative that calls on internet companies to take stronger action in policing hate-filled activities which take place on their platform. Our model policies in terms of service are the byproduct of a year-long collaboration with tech experts, civil and human rights organizations, and media rights groups. And we hope that they will help forge a safer and more tolerant future for our 21st century digital world. Now I have the pleasure of turning the program over to someone who played a critical part in shaping this initiative and who we are very proud of, CAPS Senior Fellow Henry Fernandez. Henry will introduce our new set of recommended policies and then moderate a conversation with 3 terrific leaders who are dedicating themselves to fighting the spread of extremism and speech online, something that we have seen we all need to do. So please help give a warm welcome to CAPS Senior Fellow Henry Fernandez.
Invite our panelists to come up as well. So big thank you to Neera Tandon. Also, I want to thank the wonderful CAP immigration team, specifically Jessica Kobian, Phil Walgan, and Tom Jowitz, as well as the editorial team and the meetings team and everyone else here at CAP who've been hugely supportive as we've undertaken this significant project. I'm going to introduce these panelists in a few minutes, but let me give a little bit of background on what we've done and why we're here. So following the violence in Charlottesville, the Center for American Progress joined with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Free Press, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, National Hispanic Media Coalition, and Color of Change to convene experts, as Neera said, from civil, human, and media rights groups, as well as open internet organizations, so that we could better understand how hate organizes online and to determine what could be done about it. We sought out and listened to experts on terrorism, human rights, media manipulation, technology, and law. We heard from those working here in the United States, as well as those working in Europe, Africa, and Asia. We visited with colleagues tackling the same issues in Europe and met with leaders in the United Kingdom, Germany, and the European Union to understand how they were addressing some of the same concerns in their communities. After months of research, our focus returned to what could be done here in the United States to address hate online, and we made really a key decision. We chose very early not to make a recommendation for government regulation or to advocate for legal or policy changes at the federal or state levels. But I want to say that is as part of this project. Unlike our allies in Europe, obviously we have the First Amendment, and that reflects an important commitment to severely limit government intervention in speech, whether online or offline. I do, however, want to acknowledge that there are places like foreign intervention in our elections or enforcement of things like fair housing laws, where government clearly has a role to play in legislation, regulation, and oversight. But this was not the focus of our work. So I want to block that off. We're absolutely not saying that there shouldn't be a role for regulation or government involvement in specific elements where historically government has played a key role even before there was an internet. And as those same issues move to the internet, they remain important roles for government. Instead, we focused on internet companies' self-regulation of what occurs on their platforms. Virtually all internet companies already have terms of service or acceptable use policies that purport to regulate hateful activities on their services. We decided to help make those user-facing policies more effective, fair, and transparent. These policies are often called acceptable use policies or terms of service. While these user-facing policies are an important part of reducing hateful activities online, we determined that these alone are not enough. This is evident in the reality that despite already having many of these policies, there's still far too much hate online. Thus, we also include recommendations on enforcement as well as on other corporate policies, including how staff are trained and where authority lies within management and boards for addressing hate. We sought to respect user privacy whenever possible and work to ensure that our recommendations would not create a new avenue for government intervention on user speech outside of legally available remedies that respect the First Amendment. So for instance, if government goes into a court and gets a court order or a warrant, they have that ability. We're not looking to give them additional ability through these policies to intervene with regard to speech. I want to point out that these policies have now been adopted by 40 civil and human rights organizations and reflect both an effort to help internet companies reduce hate on their platforms, as well as an organizing tool for those civil and human rights groups to have a shared set of goals when advocating with internet companies. The recommended corporate policies, we certainly made them available here as a handout, as well as a list of who the organizations are that have signed on. But they both are available as well at a website that should be going live right now called changetheterms.org. That's changetheterms.org. In addition, the documents can be found as well as a think piece that we did here at CAP explaining why we're committed to these issues. Those can be found on the CAP website. Okay, so that's the backgrounder. Now let me introduce much more interesting people who will actually talk about some of these key facts. And I'm going to introduce them all, and then we'll turn to questions for our panelists. Starting from my far right is the wonderful Heidi Beirich. Even if you don't know who Heidi Beirich is, you actually do, because she leads the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, which publishes the award-winning Intelligence Report and Hate Watch blog. They're the folks who put together the map of all hate groups in the country. That's Heidi's team, and they also are kind of the leading organization that identifies what are hate groups in the country. So she is really probably the nation's foremost expert on various forms of extremism, including the white supremacist, nativist, and neo-Confederate movements, as well as racism in academia. She's a doctor, not a medical doctor, but she went to the University of California at Berkeley and received her PhD from Purdue. Sitting to her left is Brandy Collins Dexter. Brandy serves as Senior Campaign Director for Color of Change. Color of Change is the country's largest online civil rights organization. She oversees the Media, Democracy, and Economic Justice Department, which has led a number of successful corporate and government accountability campaigns, including those that tackle online discrimination, violent speech, and the right to protest. She came to Color of Change from the Center for Media Justice, where she worked on issues such as net neutrality and the cost of phone calls from prisons. She holds a BA in history from Agnes Scott College and a JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Law. Welcome. And then finally, to my right is Jessica Gonzalez. Jessica is the Deputy Director and Senior Counselor at Free Press. She has been a key voice in the fights for net neutrality, affordable internet service, and media diversity, including that she has testified before both the House and the Senate on all of those issues. Previously, she was Executive Vice President at the National Hispanic Media Coalition, and prior to that, she was a staff attorney and teaching fellow at Georgetown Law, where she represented civil rights groups before the FCC, the NTIA, and in the Courts of Appeal. She received her BA at Loyola Marymount, her JD at Southwestern, and her LLM at Georgetown Law School. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Okay, so why don't we just kick this off, Jessica, with you, and maybe you could tell the audience, what do the policies cover, and who do they apply to?
Right, I'll try to do that. Summarize an 11-page document in 2 minutes. All right, it's a challenge. So I would say the top line of the corporate policies is that we're trying to balance the desire to disrupt organized white supremacist violence and hateful activities online with our values for free expression and privacy. So the main components, and we have 7 main recommendations. The first is for the corporations to prohibit hateful activities. And I will give that definition because I think it's really important here. Hateful activities are those that incite or engage in violence, intimidation, threats, or defamation, targeting groups or individuals based on actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, ethnicity, immigration status, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. That's the first recommendation. And the next 7 recommendations are really aimed at balancing that need to disrupt hate and racism online with due process and transparency. So the second recommendation is for the companies to expand their enforcement mechanisms, to really invest the time, resources, and human people that they need to do this in a sufficient way. The third is a very easily accessible appeals process, and that everyone or every entity that is removed for hateful activities has the ability to appeal that decision and to have transparency in that process. The fourth is to significantly increase the transparency about what is being taken down and why. The fifth is to improve the training of the content moderators that are working at these companies and to make sure that they are aware of the social, political, and cultural context of the place where they are enforcing the content moderation. So in other words, we shouldn't be outsourcing this to a place where folks are not aware of the historical context here in the US of Native genocide or of slavery. We have to understand those things to do a good job at content moderation, and to have a regular process to evaluate whether or not the measures being taken are in fact successful. The sixth point is to really about governance and corporate accountability. And the recommendation there is to appoint someone from senior management and a board committee to oversee this process and to issue an annual report, again, evaluating, is this working, is it not, and how can we improve? And then the seventh recommendation is to prohibit state actors, bot, and troll campaigns that use racism and hateful activities to forward their missions. Who do these apply to? So we very specifically said that these policies should not apply to broadband internet access providers like Comcast, Charter, and AT&T that are just providing access to the internet. Instead, we focused on internet companies, which we defined as corporations that provide a variety of services over the internet. So like social media, video sharing, event scheduling, financial transactions and fundraising, web hosting. So these are companies like Reddit, Facebook, and Twitter as a few examples who we see these policies applying to.
Also companies like PayPal and Stripe, so somewhat deeper as well.
Absolutely, yep. And so the reason we did that is because we are committed to net neutrality and to preserving the openness of the web, and thought it was really important to make that distinction between those who are providing services over the web and those who are actually providing our access.
So thanks, Jessica. So Heidi, Jessica really laid out what's in the policies. Maybe you could tell us what's the need for the policies? Why create these policies at this time?
Sure. Well, I mean, there are so many benefits to the web, but there are also significant problems that have been created by the fact that people have access to this world of information dissemination. For white supremacists in the pre-World Wide Web era, it was actually pretty hard for them to get their propaganda out, to contact other people, to organize events. And what's happened with the rise of social media and forums and so on is it has allowed this propaganda to be disseminated very quickly, allowed extremists to organize easily, to put on events together, to radicalize individuals. So these are all the things and the concerns that come along with hate activities online. And there are real world consequences here. Dylan Roof probably would not have killed those people in South Carolina if it hadn't been for the fact that he was led down sort of a rabbit trail of hate sites in the way that Google's algorithm was working at the time, that taught him to hate in the same way as somebody who might be, attracted to ISIS material online gets radicalized in that way. We know that the web has allowed things like the organizing of the first Unite the Right rallies in Charlottesville. Those were done through Facebook Messenger apps and a Facebook page. It probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so the real world consequences of access to this technology for these groups is they could raise money until PayPal and some have started to tighten up the way that those payment services work. They could raise money, they could spread propaganda, they could organize. And at the end of that pipeline, when it comes to white supremacists, what you find are hate crimes and domestic terrorism. And of course, there are other severe outcomes of when these kinds of issues aren't taken seriously, like the genocide in Myanmar and others, right? So this isn't just an American problem, but it is a real problem for us. So that, at the end of the day, is what the point of all this effort that we've taken, all of us together, is to not have those be the outcomes of web access.
Thanks, Heidi. So Brandy, let's turn to you, and maybe you can say, as an organization that really could not have existed before the internet, you do an amazing job organizing people online for social justice activism. What are you seeing with some of those activists that you're working with in relation to what's happening online, and can you give some examples?
Yeah, so definitely want to pile on to what Heidi is talking about. Our entry point into this work really comes in about late 2014, early 2015, around closed Facebook groups. And so there were violent hate groups, particularly in California and Georgia, that were sharing the personal information, including physical locations of activists working in the movement for Black Lives. People were then showing up to their home and places of work with guns, threatening violence, explicitly seeking to chill activism. We went up to Facebook in Silicon Valley with Center for Media Justice and people from chapters of BLM and really said, hey, this is happening on your platforms. This content has been flagged. It hasn't been taken down. What are you going to do about it? and we were essentially told they were looking into it. It's not that bad. There's a lot of processes putting in place. They got this. 4 years later, it's clear that they didn't have this. For years, many of us were ringing the alarm about the groups operating online. SPLC and Data and Society talked pretty extensively about the emergence of these hate groups online and how they were building power and organizing for decades. And yet, we continue to see these tech companies turn a blind eye. Many of these groups operate with kind of like less obvious names than Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis. And so as they're organizing online, they're often presenting this kind of like gateway content that's increasingly pushing people towards more violent ideologies. By having sort of loose but unenforced policies in Silicon Valley, actually what that often did was give these groups a veneer of legitimacy that allowed them to operate increasingly unchecked. They were able to push video and audio content on YouTube, sell paraphernalia and self-publish materials on Amazon, sell tickets to their events through Eventbrite, harass and seek to intimidate Black thought leaders, and particularly disproportionately women of color being harassed, and having that go unchecked on places like Twitter, and organize violent encounters on Facebook. The current policies and enforcement mechanisms that these tech companies have built are clearly not built with marginalized communities online. Too often, white supremacists and those openly threatening us with hostile, hateful, and violent speech are given a pass, and on the flip side of that, groups that are speaking out or trying to organize that or even recounting their experiences are in turn being censored. We've seen a number of prominent Black activists that have been shut down, but we've also collected stories from hundreds of everyday people who were relaying stories of harassment they had received and they were being retaliated against by the tech companies or having their content censored and taken down. So again, really in terms of like building these policies as described, it's really geared towards this idea of equity on the platforms, not seeing lopsided enforcement that's actually seeking to chill First Amendment rights.
That's well said. It turns maybe back then to Jessica, to you. Given Free Press's broader work, right, and right in your name, free and press, so a real commitment to speech and to access. So are you concerned that policies like these could chill free expression?
No, in fact, I think the opposite is true. As Brandy said, like those of us who are targeted by hate speech often choose not to speak because we're scared of the retaliation. And so I think it's really critical that these corporations, do this on their own. Right now what's happening is that internet companies have policies and they're not being enforced well, right? What we've done here is say, actually, you have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to amplification. You don't have the right to amplification. And we've created a set of rules and robust transparency and rights of appeal, and the details of the enforcement and training section of our policies. What they really bring out is you can have policies, but you need to do a better job of actually implementing them. You have to have people that understand the difference between racism and anti-racism. You can't rely on algorithms alone. Computers can't know everything about the social, political, and historical context of a place. So you actually, if you want to protect free speech on your platform and protect especially the voices of those who are often targets of hate, you actually have to be proactive and invest resources, time, and people that know what they're doing and that have a really excellent race analysis to apply the policies. And so if that can happen, if the true, if the details of these policies can be put into place, I actually think we'll have much more robust platforms for free speech online.
So I actually want to stay on this point then and come back to something, Brandy, that you said, but also concerns that even internet companies raised with us. You're smiling, so. But internet companies, and as well as some people working in this, working on civil rights and on open internet issues, raised with us that Given historic disparities in the enforcement of rules, whether that's the enforcement of criminal justice or criminal laws, whether it's the enforcement of corporate policies, there's been a history of rule enforcement being biased against people of color and other historically discriminated against groups. So we've heard this concern, particularly in the context of things like Oscars So White, and Black Lives Matter. With these rules that we're promulgating here, will these kinds of groups be kicked off of internet platforms under your policies? And how do you balance those concerns? How do you think about those things?
Yeah, I laugh a little bit because I think it's really funny hearing the internet companies say we shouldn't have these policies because we are unable to make sure they're enforced evenly or in service of equity. I think oftentimes when we hear Silicon Valley or any company say it's not possible, usually it means it's just not financially optimal. And in this case, we're really calling on them and the sort of like to have a heightened level of social responsibility and integrity in the way that we've often heard a lot of the CEOs of these companies demonstrate through their speeches online, to have that play out within their infrastructure. I think the devil is always in the details. It is a legitimate concern. Often those in need of free speech are the ones, most in need of free speech are the ones that have the least amount of access to it and the higher consequences for it. That is true. And we certainly have pointed out, all of our groups working together over the years, the disproportionate way in which marginalized groups have been silenced under these current policies at an alarming rate. But I think what's largely driving the disparate enforcement of these rules is a lack of genuine investment in tackling these issues, as well as the sort of stunning lack of transparency that we see in how policies, guidelines, and enforcement mechanisms play out. And so a couple of examples, when I think about Facebook, in the last year and a half, we've seen multiple content moderation training documents leaked. The first listed white men as a more protected category than Black children. Another one leaked a document which showed an erroneous distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism, with definitions copied and pasted from Wikipedia. And just last week, we saw that Facebook's new political ad policy is treating non-political ads that mention Black people, women, Latinx, LGBTQ communities as political, resulting in even more erroneous takedowns. We think that there's more to be done. We think that there's more ways in which they can really examine how these policies play out. There's more investment, and by requiring these companies to publicly disclose their content moderation materials, that also allows for our groups to kind of like actively monitor and serve as a check and balance. I think, again, like oftentimes we hear from these different companies this is not feasible, and we can point to examples, even though we know that the US functions differently than Europe. We have seen in Germany, we have seen in other places, and we have even seen within certain companies like PayPal this kind of heightened responsibility and call to really do more to protect its users. And so we're asking that to be a cultural norm and shift. That's going to take work, but that's part of what we're committed to as groups, to continue to hold them accountable.
That's actually an excellent point, this idea of companies have found creative solutions when either forced, for instance, in Germany under their new laws, which have massive fines. Companies have found solutions to resolve these issues. But also in the case of, for instance, YouTube, they've been incredibly creative and built out new technology to address copyright issues, so that, and even negotiated agreements with record companies and artists around the ability for people to play their music in the background of their videos. And so where there's a will and there's financial incentive, it appears there's a way. Yeah. So Heidi, maybe coming towards the end, and then we can go to some questions from the audience. A couple of times folks have mentioned companies that go beyond Twitter and Facebook. And in fact, these policies go well beyond Twitter and Facebook and Google. reaching deeper into what we might call the stack of the internet with the internet service providers, the Verizons, the Comcasts of the world, the AT&Ts. So those broadband providers at the bottom of the stack, and a company like a Facebook or an edge provider at the top of the stack. There's a lot of services in between those two, and these policies don't reach all the way down the stack, but do reach deeper than just Facebook and Twitter and providers like that, and address companies like PayPal and Stripe, companies that as well that provide chat services, a range of other activities. Why did you think it was important, or why do you think it's important to go deeper into the stack in this way?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately the reasoning goes back to how white supremacists and other extremists use the web. First of all, they are very clever. These are not ignorant people when it comes to accessing every kinds of technology and platform that they can get their hands on. They tend to be early adopters. People often don't realize that the first hate site went up online in 1995, Stormfront, and that was because they understood that the only way they were going to build their movements and connect with other people was to sort of go around the regular media and other organizations and connect one-on-one. So the web's been a godsend for them. So because of this, they have basically tried to use, for example, every kind of online payment processor. So it's not just PayPal that a lot of them were using for a long time. If they can't get PayPal, then they bounce to Stripe. If they can't do that, they try to figure out a way to get credit card companies to give them access. If they're not allowed to post their stuff on Facebook, then they're going to find out how to use a chat service, create their own forums, for example, their own websites. So, you know, you really have to go beyond these like larger corporations or these mainstream platforms that we think about if you're going to curb hateful activities, because it runs the gamut of all the things that you mentioned, Henry. And so one of the things that we did in these policies is to kind of lay out the layers, not where it would stop somebody from ever getting on the internet at kind of the top, but all the layers of web services and different types of web platforms that are going to help these people be able to organize their ugly activities, to raise funds, and so on. It includes ad services, for example, you know, that run on YouTube videos and whatnot. And some of these things have been tackled at this point, especially since Charlottesville, by the big platforms, not perfectly, as Brandy and Jessica were pointing out, but to some extent addressed. But it's actually a pretty complex environment that white supremacists work in, and so we're attempting with our policies to grasp the bulk of that, right, and to try to remove these things as much as possible from the web without sort of stopping somebody from being able to do the equivalent of make a phone call, right, with the internet.
Great. So looking at time, why don't we actually maybe turn to questions from the audience, and how do we do this? We'll ask our expert. Anything we should know? No? All right. So the way we're going to do this is, if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and then and if you would stand and identify, give your name, and if you have any organizational affiliation, that would be great. If you don't follow that process, I will ask you to wait in line, and we'll try to get to you. But I would also ask if you could actually ask a question, and a question is not the same as making a long statement and then ending it by saying, "Don't you agree?" So if you could ask a question, that would be good. If you want to open it to the whole panel, that would be fine. If you want to ask of a specific panelist, that's fine too. So why don't we start right here, then we'll go to the back, and we'll come over here. Yes. Oh, and please do wait for the microphone since we're C-SPAN and otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Abbas Barzagar with the Council of American and Islamic Relations. I'm pretty new to this space, and I'm trying to get my head around what the financial and business model sort of obstacles are to doing increased monitoring and flagging and prevention and intervention of this kind of speech. In another life, I'm a business owner, and if somebody wants to use my cafe for something, I want to know what they're doing. and I can ask them to leave if I don't agree with what they're doing, and if they don't leave, I can hire security guards. What are the options that are available to us to assist ISPs and others to sort of make their environments more safe?
Yeah. Any of the panelists?
I mean, look, there's always a role for civil rights organizations and individuals to flag materials, right, directly to the companies based on whatever terms of service they have. One of the concerns I think that all of us share is that the burden really at the end of the day shouldn't be on that, right? It should be on the corporations to use their massive profits to put in place serious operations to get rid of this information. It can't be done in sort of a piecemeal way. And also, I mean, one of the terrible things about flagging, even though it needs to exist, is you've already exposed somebody to that hate speech by the time that you're flagging it, right? So it would be preferable if that never had to happen. So I don't know if there's something people want to add, but I mean, that's how I view it.
Yeah, and I think the costs really are, they have to do with like actually hiring people that can develop culturally relevant training materials and significantly staffing up, right? One of the things we learned when we went to Germany was that when Germany, and we're not going to adopt a law here, but the learning that we had there was that when Germany created a law and said, if you're going to do content moderation here, you have to hire people from Germany. And Germany and Facebook ended up like hiring thousands of people to do content moderation. So it is possible, and we've seen it happen in other places. But it does require significant investment in training, materials, staff, oversight. That's the financial costs, and then an investment of time from people at the top who need to demonstrate a commitment, that a social responsibility, right? Of we're making massive profits off this platform, and we do feel a responsibility to our users and to our customers to keep them safe.
I saw a question in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. My name is Claudia, and I am representing the Arab American Institute. I had a question. How do you define hate groups, and kind of what could be some of the negative ramifications of having a legal definition of a hate group? And then kind of a second question, for groups like the Canary Mission, who have their own online platform, but put individuals who are in maybe pro-Palestine BDS or BDS groups on Facebook on the same list as KKK members, how can security regulations and privacy regulations treat those groups?
Maybe I can just respond and then turn it over to Heidi. So the scope of these policies, the policies themselves do not go about defining hate groups. What they define is hateful activities. And I'm happy to read the definition. Again, I read it at the top, but it really is activities that engage or incite, incite violence, intimidation, harassment, or defamation against groups or people. Obviously, SPLC has done extensive work on hate group classification, but the scope of these policies really is focused on defining hateful activities and not hate groups.
Yeah, I didn't have anything to add. I was going to say the same thing, Jessica.
I did want to put a quick plug though, because we have another project which Heidi talked about, which is called Blood Money, which examined a number of violent hate groups operating online. And for us, we relied heavily on the research of SPLC. They have really been at the forefront of really being particular around defining how we're talking about violent groups, and I think relying also us on that kind of court definition of sort of violent actions and what that means for folks. I think that's the line. We're not talking about people going online and saying that they hate X group. We're talking about people that are selling bullets dipped in pig's blood to Modan Muslims. We're talking about people that are actively organizing to create chaos in small liberal white communities, which we see very organized efforts happening. These are people that are not just yelling about things online, but inciting death and violence and hate offline. And that for us is a really important distinction, which Jessica, I think, talked about as well at the top.
I would maybe reemphasize one piece of what Brandy said, which is that the policies do actually look to both actions online and offline. But I think it's worth taking a look at them. We actually worked very, very hard on this, how we defined hateful activities, and I thought Jessica did a great job of being able to summarize that. Well done. So way in the back, and then I think there was a question up here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, Josie Lair, Men's Story Project, and UCSF Center for Health Policy Studies. Speaking of offline activities, what about the statements of our president? Are those incitement, and what can we do about them?
Yeah, again, maybe I would say I'd have to think about which statements in particular, but you know, the going to the hateful activities element specifically, you know, I think I'd have to look at specific specific activities. I do think that the internet companies are in somewhat of a bind when it comes to Trump, because there may be elements that go to incitement, as you described. Again, I'd have to really look at them to say that. But there's also the issue of providing the public access to the statements from the President of the United States, right? And so I think, well, I have to say, we did not spend significant time or any time really talking about Trump as we thought about these policies. I do think it's a unique, obviously for all of us, right? It's a unique situation, but it puts when the statements are specifically from Trump, it puts the companies in a unique bind, because they're also news providers, and that content is news in some ways, right? And reporting on that content is news. So I'm not speaking for the group on this, so I don't know if other folks have thoughts. Yeah.
I would say yes would be our short answer.
Yeah.
At Color of Change, we have definitely called for Trump's personal account to be removed from Twitter. He has retweeted fake statistics from known white supremacists. Like, he has gone after journalists, and we're seeing, like, we saw the impacts of that this year in Maryland, and even as recently in the last 24 hours. We strongly believe that, you know, we hear that the platform's excuse is that this is newsworthy content, and as publishers that don't want to be regulated as publishers, they think that it's important to keep putting that information out. But I think the intentional spread of violent misinformation that is having direct implications of safety and people on the ground, I think that's a classic case of incitement. And so that's where Color of Change stands, you know, outside of the very thoughtful work that I know has gone into this coalition.
I was just going to say, there have been a couple instances where it really does look like, I'm thinking of when Trump retweeted those videos, anti-Muslim videos over the past summer that were put out by a group that eventually was proscribed in Britain, actually, disbanded. In any event, it is a bind. I mean, Jack Dorsey of Twitter has said so, right?
Well, if he says so.
If he says so, it makes him right. No.
You wanted to say something on this, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with Brandy on this. We don't have a, I don't know that we really didn't spend a lot of time talking about the president, but I'm sure we could go case by case as examples. As a Mexican American, I can think of a specific example of group defamation that would apply here, right? So would he violate these policies? Likely, on a case by case basis we can look. Will he get taken down? Probably not.
I'm convinced. Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm from the Committee to Protect Journalists. I, like Heidi mentioned, these alt-right groups are really, really good at the internet. They're very clever. Do you worry that the more we kind of try to push them out of the mainstream platforms, that they're just going to find darker corners of the internet that's going to be harder for groups like you and civil society groups to monitor them?
Well, let me just say, I'm not worried about monitoring them. What I'm worried about is their ability to spread propaganda or run like troll campaigns like they have, especially against journalists and others. I'm more worried about that. In other words, the general public being infected sort of like a virus by this propaganda than I am forcing them into 4chan or 8chan or on Gab. At least they're kind of speaking to the choir as opposed to speaking to the world. Like there's no Dylan Roof that they're going to somehow suck into their terrible thinking. So that's basically where I come down on that. I'd rather have them off places where they can interact with larger numbers of people.
Yeah, I mean, their ability to engage in widespread campaigns that normalize racism and dehumanize people to the extent that people don't even care if certain groups of folks are, left to rot in cages or killed. I think that's where it's a line, right, that we have to draw. But I'm sort of with Heidi on this one, that we got to kind of balance the interests here.
I agree, and I'll just add one small example. I think part of what I think is so important around the development of these is that, as we've spoken to on this panel, we've seen these companies try to create policies, and oftentimes they leave a lot of gaps that actually make things worse. And so one example is Facebook's attempt to attack fake news. And one of the pieces that they put in there was like, the more something is attacked in the comments as being illegitimate, the more it gets marked as fake news. This is a pretty well-known tactic of trolls to go on to YouTube pages, onto Facebook pages, and say, this is absolutely not true. It's a coordinated effort. And so a policy like that, without color in it, has a really bad impact on independent journalists, media outlets, citizen journalists, et cetera. And so what we want to do is create policies that allow for some nuance in really tackling the problem, not just putting forward false solutions.
It might also be important to note, in addition to everything that the panelists said, that when it was through mainstream vehicles, particularly Twitter, that journalists, and particularly Jewish journalists, were attacked with images of Jews being killed in concentration camps. Right? That this was a kind of a major push, I think an organized push, as Brandy described, right, to attack journalists. That was possible because these hate groups had a presence on these mainstream, large market, broad audience vehicles, and so most journalists aren't on Gab. I'm not sure that any human being would want to be on Gab if they're not in a hate group, there has been the effort to create like an alternative to Patreon, which I think is Hatreon. They actually brand it themselves as a hate vehicle. So there's a big difference if you're able to use a ubiquitous provider like GoDaddy for URL provision, or PayPal for internet payment, versus being able to use some fringe provider. And certainly in the financial space, there are virtually no fringe providers. Right. So we'll go right here. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. Hi, Stephanie Foster from Smash Strategies, and thanks so much for this. I'm curious what you think about how these kind of principles might apply when we're really looking at gender-based violence online and harassment, which is obviously, you touched on it, but it's a slightly different problem. So I'm curious if you see any things that could be learned from this in that arena to try to stop gender-based violence online, or things that are different challenges that you might see. Thank you.
Gender-based violence, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are incredibly important. I think I knew, but I was really shocked when we started asking our members around some of the things that they had encountered online on Facebook. And we received stories from women that said that there was like a man on Facebook who was looking at women within a 30-mile radius of him after the Women's March, and were sending these like sort of direct threats to them and having that go unchecked. And I think she might have posted one of them and then she got taken down. Or and particularly we've seen leaders and women of color be viciously attacked in these spaces. I myself have seen things that I'm a little uncomfortable with that are like explicitly gendered. And so I think with these policies and with the description that Jessica gave at the top, we're really looking at all the ways in which violence is being incited against marginalized communities, against women, against the LGBTQ community, against Muslim communities, against Jewish communities. Like really, we're looking at it all.
Anything to add, Heidi or Jessica?
I just, the question reminded me that the misogyny that you find online is astounding. And most of the leaders of white supremacist groups, especially the young ones, these alt-right types, they really came up through Gamergate and places where they started with misogyny and then added to that this kind of intense racial animus. So, I mean, I think that, you know, our thought is that these policies apply to that kind of hateful activity as well.
No question. So we'll go right here, and then you'll be next. Nope, sorry. We'll eventually get there, though.
Hi, Kathy Berger from the Dangerous Speech Project. Thank you very much. And I'm really interested in the recommendation to have better kind of cultural, social, and political understanding of the context in which people are doing speech monitoring, especially since we know that often harmful speech uses really coded language that might be better understood in a context. I'm curious the kind of work that you've put into thinking about how this will actually work in practice. So on the first side, I'm curious about language. Are you also interested in making sure that there are enough people who are doing the monitoring that speak local languages? We just met with a group of Burmese activists and journalists a few days ago, and they mentioned that one of their big challenges with working with Facebook is just the lack of kind of Burmese language knowledge, right? And then the other question is, do you see this meaning that there are going to be content moderators in every country in the world right away? Are you suggesting that maybe there would be kind of at-risk countries that are the first ones that are like opt-in staff, or how does this actually work in practice from your side?
Yeah, so we definitely talked about language. I will just say, like, we were somewhat focused on the United States application, though we did like learn from and consider like how this would apply internationally as well. I think we do anticipate that content moderators need to be in the place, or at least from the place, or have significant understanding of how the place works. And in order to really adequately do the content moderation, I think we contemplated like an academic component to this, where like these companies are good at like research. Like we actually need to do some research, and they need to bring in some experts who really understand the context of a place, and they need to build out training materials accordingly and have folks. I mean, one of the things that we talked a lot about was actually bringing in content moderators from communities that are often the targets of this speech. And while I don't imagine that sounds like a fun job, I think it's really important for them to be directly informed by the folks who are often the targets and who really understand the dynamics and the subtleties, and like you said, the dog whistles that are often used that don't, might fly over someone's head, but if you're aware of like the political or historical context, it hits you right away.
And I think it's important to distinguish, right? I mean, we're talking a lot about these larger companies, which I think have the ability to do this work in a much broader environment. The largest number of people doing this work are in Germany, because Germany says if you don't do this work, we'll fine you heavily. But so I definitely agree with what Jessica said. I would also point to the Dangerous Speech Project's work with Twitter, for instance, right, around issues of dehumanization and looking at both how can we be specific to a specific place. I mean, the Facebook acknowledges, right, that it had a major failure in Myanmar, specifically because it lacked Burmese speakers, right, and that this then the United Nations said contributed to as a precursor to genocide, right? But I think what's interesting about the dehumanization work that the Dangerous Speech Project is doing, many things are interesting, but with Twitter, is that it's actually looking for some things that cut across different countries, different parts of the world. That when we look at what precedes violence, especially large-scale violence like genocide or ethnic cleansing, it's often preceded or almost always preceded by this dehumanization. And so there are both things that are specific, I think, as Jessica pointed out, and as your question referenced, but also some things that need to be developed which are true across geographies. And then I think there was a question, yes, right behind. Yeah.
Morning. My name is Ryan McKinley with Castle Ruby here in D.C. I read an article yesterday, the amounts of transgender women and women in men's prisons. How do we advocate to actually get them transferred to a women's facility?
So I'm not sure if we're the experts on the specifics of how to create the transfer, but we did quite a bit of work around looking at how transgendered people were being targeted online, and we've attempted to embrace to create some understandings within these policies about how to respond to that. So I don't know that we can speak specifically to the prison question that you raised, but I think more broadly we have seen targeting in this space, and we tried to be responsive to it. So I'm going to go to the woman right next, and then we'll go, and then I think we'll be coming close to the end.
I'm Marion Bacher from the German Cultural Institute. I have two questions, and they are somehow linked. About the moderators, I think one of the things is not only that they are trained and everything, but that you think about how traumatic it can be to put down all the hate speech. And I know the job description more in a lower payment scale, and people are totally left alone. So that would be maybe something which should be invested. And the other question is, why should companies do this? I mean, they are not philanthropists. They are gaining money with that. So why? What should be their incentives, and what could be on our side to push them to do it, and also to incorporate the trauma work in a way in the whole scheme?
For their own employees, yeah. Thoughts on both of those questions, or either?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. So quickly in the back, I'm going to put my online organizing hat and say we do have infrastructure for starting different campaigns, and so outside of this work. So if you're interested and want to share information, we can talk more about the point you raised around activism online and how we can help.
Specifically to the question about organizing for
yeah.
transgender people in
yeah,
prison.
for transgender people in prison. To this other question, I think there's a couple pieces. So one, the big thing that I think I'm sitting with, and that I think we're all thinking about, is that part of what is not done by these, and part of what needs to happen, is a sort of general reckoning in Silicon Valley around cultural norms within a lot of Silicon Valley and tech companies. There's groups like coworker.org that do a lot of organizing of workers. We've seen research that shows that a disproportionately high amount of donations to white supremacist sites come from Santa Clara and come from Silicon Valley. And we've heard Richard Spencer say that the average alt-right guy is a 28-year-old IT guy. And so there's a lot of work that part of what we're hoping is that there's a lot of work internally in these corporations around really creating the culture that these celebrity CEOs have said that they wanted, The other piece of that is that like people of color do disproportionately over-index on a lot of these platforms, are also early adopters. We've seen in some of the hits that Facebook has taken that like as these stories are coming out, people are getting turned off. It is hitting their bottom line in different ways. And unless Facebook can come up with more adequate answers, and some of these other tech companies, we think that they will continue to take financial hits. And this is a natural part of what I think their adoption to the circumstances and the culture and the climate that we're living in right now, that has to come through. And we see them trying to do it and consistently getting it wrong, which is why I think we're offering more of a roadmap on that.
You want to say a word about the report card process that's the next step of this?
Yeah, I want to respond first to the labor thing that she raised, though. I think it's a really good point. It's not encompassed in these policies. I do think there needs to be other efforts to diversify Silicon Valley and to ensure that folks are getting paid adequately, and that especially for content moderators, and especially if we're asking content moderators to come from target communities, that there is really robust mental health support for them. The report card process that Henry alluded to is a little check-in that we're going to do probably around May 2019 on how the major internet companies are doing. Whether they say they're going to adopt the policies or not, we are going to take a deep look at whether they have adopted our hateful activities definition, how they're doing with takedowns, have they increased transparency, have they beefed up their enforcement mechanisms and staffed up, have they developed a system for corporate governance that answers all the way to the top on disrupting hate online, and basically goes sort of step by step to evaluate to the best we can with the data available how the companies are doing with that.
And I would put a plug in as well for just to this question around transparency. We're actually asking internet companies to become significantly more transparent with the data that they're providing. And we believe that this will then allow for researchers, whether at universities or elsewhere, to dig into that data in the same way that they use other large data sets that are publicly available. They'll be able to dig into that data to try to figure out what works. And so one example of this is we've spent a lot of time talking about, or we spent some time now in the policies talking about the ability for people to flag, and for civil rights organizations and others to flag hateful activities. The data that Google now makes available with regard to YouTube indicates that the overwhelming majority of content that's removed for being hateful or for otherwise being dangerous, say ISIS videos or recruitment videos, that sort of thing, the overwhelming majority is removed by Google's technology, by its artificial intelligence and other technologies removing that content. And so civil rights groups have spent a lot of time focused on flagging, but at least in the YouTube example, once the data became available, we recognize that in fact it's the use of technology to remove this content, which has much greater impact, certainly in this one particular large platform. We actually don't know that for most other platforms because they're not transparent. The more information we can get, the better policies and strategies we can promulgate. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Adam Neufeld from the ADL. I was wondering what your thoughts were on how platforms are radicalizing people other than just exposing them to hate. So I'm thinking of, if you type in the word, Muslim, does it come up with a history of Islam or ISIS? If you type in immigrant, does it come up with MS-13, something else? Same thing, YouTube recommendations. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think this will be our final question, so yes.
I think it's like a horror story online. I mean, look, I know that there was an article just, I think 2 weeks ago about Bing having this problem as you typed something in, then just terrible things about whatever you were looking for come up. Google has battled this kind of algorithmic problem for, quite a while now. So all of that autocomplete stuff has got to be cleaned up. I don't care if you're talking about, African Americans, immigrants, Muslims, et cetera. I mean, it's sort of part of, the issues that we're trying to deal with right there. And that, of course, was the tragic way that you got Dylan Roof. So, it's a serious issue, an important one, and I know one that the ADL has brought to the attention of the providers as well.
There are really horrible examples, right? So of just the issue that you're raising. Our colleagues from NHMC, National Hispanic Media Coalition, have pointed out that one of the worst things you can do is type Latina girls into the search engine, right? That you're not going to get information on YA books for Latina girls, right? That you're going to get horrible examples of pornography, that sort of thing in many cases. So this is clearly another area that a lot of work needs to be done. So I want to just ask folks to please take a look at the policies and go to the website, changetheterms.org. And at that website, you can not only take a look at the policies and look at who else is signed on, but you can personally sign on, and you can also reach out to us if you would like your organization to sign on. And what we're asking organizations who sign on to do is to, in their conversations with internet companies, that they would point to these policies as things that they want the internet companies to embrace and to take on and to follow. But also, we certainly encourage organizations to, as well, really look at these policies as the floor. As was pointed out with regard to the search engine question that just occurred, or some of the other questions, these policies don't cover everything. We do think that they bring a much better understanding of what we think is possible, and with the additional data that we're asking companies to provide, we think that the community more broadly, the academic community, the civil rights community, the human rights community, will be able to make additional recommendations about improvements that need to occur. Because these technologies, the kind of big technologies we've been talking about, and companies we've been talking about, these technologies are going to change in the same way that they've been changing for the last decade. But also new companies, startups, are going to be entering the mix, and with new technologies, new ways of communicating. And so we don't see these policies as being something that doesn't get amended from time to time as new technologies come into play or as companies change their business models. But we thought it was incredibly important to lay the groundwork now, and as civil rights organizations, human rights organizations, organizations committed to social justice, that there be a set of guidelines where we say, this is what we believe companies need to do in order to have the internet be a place that we can all share without being attacked because of the way we look or who we love or how we worship. So I would ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists for a wonderful job. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And the panelists will be up here if you want to ask questions, or if you're members of the press who want to talk to them.